heritage. Lovely. I love it. We're all being recorded now. Thank you, Graham. Hassel Heritage, we looked at St Matthew's, Windsor. We went out to Ebenezer, where Roland Hassel actually first was preaching under a tree, which is still there. Of course, when he first went out in the very early 1800s, there was no building there. And so we were looking at where people are laid to rest and what they're doing. And we had some very good speakers that John secured for that day, and very, very interesting. So that's the Hassel heritage will change over the years. You'll say, yep, I want to go on that, or no, I don't want to go on that, or I'll go on something else. Or you might like to run something yourself. Genealogy. Richard, are you able to speak briefly on that, or can we hear you, Richard? No. It's still very, very crackly. We can't understand you. There's something horribly wrong, but the genealogy, Richard, of course, would give a much better explanation. Mine's going to be very short, and just to say that he is the one that locates each person and puts them on our family tree exactly where they belong, and he's been doing it, well, I think he started for the 1998 reunion and been going ever since. There are so many people to place and to carefully place and to make sure that they're placed in the right family tree seating. The website, I meant to put the link there, but unfortunately I didn't. Graham, you might have it off by heart. Is it hasselnet.net.au?
It's on the back of all of our newsletter. It might be
and it's in the newsletter, so if you want, it would be exciting to locate the website and go on your own sense of adventure for that one with all the Hassel information. It's been started to be built just fairly recently, and Margaret Hassel has done an amazing job, and she's absolutely devoted to getting putting things up there for everybody to know, not just a few. The Reconciliation Project was a new one started, I think, for the May 2023 reunion. I don't think I can speak to that at this stage, but obviously the title tells you about that it would have truth tellings, etc. In that project. The AGM, and it's in the action column for that, it says attend if you wish. Wednesday, 6th of August, 7 p.m. And we look forward to seeing you there if you... the link is in the newsletter, so please join us if you wish. The events, I've already spoken about the recent Windsor tour. I really would like to do the trip out to O'Connell again, probably would be next year. And the reason that O'Connell is particularly of interest to all the Hassels, because 6 out of the 8 Thomas Hassel children were granted land out there in 1818. So, and at that stage, Thomas was only 14. No, that can't be right. Thomas was 1818. Thomas would have been 24. So his siblings would have been all a lot younger than that. But they all certainly went out there. Roland loved it out there because it was cold, slushy, snowy, freezing, like England, where he'd come from. He just loved it. the Sydney Research Meeting and dinner, that we would like to have something up and running soon, and certainly it says to be announced. We will keep you posted once we get a time and a place and what we're going to do. The Hassel Research meetings have been held at the State Library for over a number of years, and certainly have been well attended and have had some wonderful speakers, but also they have memorabilia there which can be brought up and shown and so discussed. So you get a lot more of a tangible session of what the Hassels had. There's a proposed Tahiti trip in 2027. I'm not sure whether it's March or May. I don't have the date, but again, all that information is in the newsletter. And there's a 230-year reunion plan for 2028, and we're just in the throes of shaping that at the moment. For anything else, for any events, etc., any suggestions, we will always be listening to you, and all suggestions are welcome. For what on the next part of our tour through tonight, I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown on the first, second and third Hassel generations. And then Jenny is going to do a focus story on Dr. Robert Culbertson Hope, who married Catherine Elizabeth Hassel, Thomas's second child. And after that, it will be open for people to discuss artefacts and anything else that we'd like to do. So, or talk about, I mean. So here we go, down memory lane for the first, second and third generations. Most of the other family lines will be looking at their first, second and third generations. Who are they, what they do, and where did they go? First generation, we're counting the first generation as Roland Hassel, his vintage. So in his vintage, there are 4. I'm jumping the gun with putting the Marstons there, but that's okay, you'll bear with me. But all I want you to do is look at their dates, look at how old they were, the 4 of them, how many children were their siblings, so Roland was one of 6, and where did they actually travel from and to? And what you'll notice is they all came from England. They all went to Parramatta. The men went back to, Roland Hassel didn't go back to England. Samuel Marsden certainly did. But the women went to Parramatta and around that area, but they would have been travelling to Bathurst, etc., but they didn't live anywhere else. So you'll notice also that Roland Hassel and Elizabeth Hancock's were married in Holy Trinity Church, Coventry. You'll also notice that Samuel Marsden married Elizabeth Friston, and they were married in Holy Trinity Church, Hull in Yorkshire. Now, I also made a point here of talking about poor Elizabeth Marsden, who was Elizabeth Friston, suffered a stroke at the age of 39 and was paralysed down her left side, which would have been a huge blow in those days because she was a pretty active type of lady who liked to be involved in a lot of things, but also it would have stifled Samuel Marsden's movements, his thinking, and I say stifled, perhaps it made him feel awful, but it didn't stop him doing anything of where he went and what he was doing. So when you think of that, they were 1768, 66, 65, and then the last one was born in 1772. If you think of your school history days, what were you learning about in the world that was happening in the 1760s? my mind goes straight away that, oh, Mozart would have been about 12 then. So you align it with the things that you know and what was happening in the world. And then they all died in the early 1800s, and what was happening there. We didn't even get the Industrial Revolution was just trying to trigger its way through the world in those times, early 1800s. So to set the scene, you've got to think of what else was happening there, which is all very exciting. And if anybody wants to say anything about that, they can. But otherwise, I'll flip to our next adventure page. The second generation, we're going to look at Roland's children, of course. And Roland's children, the one family line we're interested in is in bold. And you've got all the hassles down the left-hand side. And now the family starts to grow and bring in all these other families, like we're bringing in the Marsden family. Milam family, I don't know a lot about, but you might. The Rouse family, Lowry family, Lloyd family, Walkers, the Shelleys, Campbells, and the last one, unfortunately, didn't make it past 14 months of age. So Roland had 9 children and he had 62 grandchildren. I believe he had about 164 great-grandchildren. Thomas Hassel. So Thomas Hassel is the one that we're interested in, and I've already been of where he went. Coventry. He was born in Coventry. He went to Tahiti as a 3-year-old, landed in Parramatta as about a 4-year-old. Had land in O'Connell, went back to Coventry, Lampeter, I think he went to Cambridge too, is that right, Graham? Travelled a lot in England, came back to Parramatta.
Excuse me, Alison.
Yes.
We just ask everybody to mute themselves, unless they're the...
Came back to Parramatta, and then when he came back, he was, of course, a minister. And so he was assigned Port Macquarie, but he left Port Macquarie there because he was very disturbed about what was happening up there. And I don't know whether he chose to leave or whether they suggested it was a good idea that he come back. And he was very much then focused on O'Connell and Bathurst, and then came back to Cobbitty. So in 1818, Thomas and his 5 siblings were promised the grant of land in O'Connell, and that came to fruition in about 1824, I think, because they were all fairly young. Thomas, was only 14 years old when they got the grants of land. But I believe ministers' children that was not an uncommon practice, that they were given grants of land, and that was probably a way of repaying what was happening with ministers and missionaries, etc. Thomas Hassel was very uncomfortable with the treatment of the convicts in Port Macquarie. He found that very difficult. I've only read a little bit about that. But on his way back to rub salt into a wound, he lost most of his possessions in a sinking ship, lost all his library books on his return to Sydney, so it would have left a fairly nasty taste in his mouth. By the 1840s, Thomas had accumulated quite a lot of wealth, etc., but he was financially liable when the Depression came, and so he was allowed to keep 2 of his properties, I believe, and I will stand corrected there if that needs to be. He was a much loved man, and 600 people went to his funeral, and he was what we say a truly good man. He married Anne Marsden.
Sorry, can I just chip in there? It's most likely it would have been 600 men at his funeral, because the women didn't tend to go to the funerals. So actually it would have been a lot more had it been open to everybody.
Yes. Wow, good point. Yes, quite amazing. Anne Marsden She was born at sea, and I believe to keep her clothes dry, her father, Reverend Samuel Marsden, had to put them on his chest, and that's how they were dried off with the heat of his body. And she lived about, as you can see, 1868 there for Thomas, 1885. She lived another 20 years after he died in 1868. She was in Parramatta. So she was born at sea, just outside Sydney, lived in Parramatta, went to England between the age of 6 to 16 to be educated, came back to Parramatta, went to Port Macquarie, of course, with Thomas, O'Connell and Cobberty. So she went to England with Reverend James Cover, who, of course, Roland Hassel would have known. I'm not quite sure. You can tell me, was Cover one of the missionaries that went to Tahiti? She was schooled in England and returned to Australia at the age of 16. And if you work that out, she would have come back to Australia about the year before her mother had stroke. So that would have been a bit tough for her to watch that. She was fairly active and had a lot of energy and always wanted to be involved with things, as did her mother. And they were certainly very active in having their say on the church, Weatherfirst Church, with Roland and Thomas Hassel and Samuel Marsden, with where the Bathurst Church was going to go to find the land. They were wanting to find land there. Guess what they called the Bathurst Church? Can you, if you remember where?
Holy Trinity.
Holy Trinity, that's right. So Samuel Marsden and his wife were married at Holy Trinity in York or Hull or somewhere, and Roland Hassel and his wife were married in Holy Trinity in Coventry. So the first church over the mountains was called Holy Trinity. Don't know whether that came from them or not, I don't know. The third generation, of course, is Roland's grandchildren. So Thomas and Anne's children. There they are, the parents, Thomas and Anne, handsome couple. And their children are Reverend James, Catherine Elizabeth, Marianne, George, Harriet, Charles, Eliza, and Emily. She was the one that died at 14 months, so I was wrong with the other age. We've got more families coming into the Hassel fold here. We've got Dixons, we've got the Hopes now, and we've got the Oxleys. So the Hassels are broadening their horizon with the families that are coming into their fold. I just thought because the camera was being invented before they all died, you can look at their death dates there. The camera was well and truly into society by then. But I thought I'd show you Reverend James, handsome man, Catherine Elizabeth. Then I got it out of order and my technology skills went haywire and I got Harriet. Then we've got George and Charles. No, Marianne came up, did she? Then we've got Charles and Eliza. And you'll notice that in this third generation, not all of them married. So we had 3 unmarried, so their grandchildren are going to be less in number. The third generation, this is a lot to look at here. So you only have to scan it. You don't have to read everything there at all because I can send it to you anyway. There are all the children down the left-hand side. Look at their ages that they live to. 81, 98, 84, 82, 80, 87, 83. Quite grand ages, aren't they? And their children, of course, 4 of them produced, we have 35 grandchildren, whereas Roland's grandchildren were 62, wasn't it, from memory? Where did they go? So we had studying to be a minister. Here's another Holy Trinity Church in Berrima that the eldest son, James Samuel, had something to do with it. And he, of course, wrote the book In Old Australia. Most of you, if you haven't read it, you've heard about it or heard of sections that are in it. Quite an interesting, fascinating read. The Hassel boys all attended King's School, Parramatta. Where did they go? And you'll notice that all of them spread their wings from Parramatta. Some of them went into Queensland. Some of them went into Victoria. So we were really spreading our wings out into Australia. And this is the whole overarching purpose of looking at the Hassels from the 3 generations of where did they go from after Parramatta? Where did we spread out to? And you'll notice that, and it'd be interesting to have a map of the eastern side of Australia and actually pinpoint where they went to. Catherine Elizabeth married a fellow who was born in Scotland. He was a doctor, property owner and politician, and they went down to Melbourne. And Jenny's going to tell us more about this. Robert Hope, where he came from, etc. So Marianne married Robert's brother, George Hope. They didn't all come out together from Scotland, but a lot of the Hopes came out here. And you'll notice also that the children of Thomas and Anne Marsden, the girls were all very good horsewomen. They enjoyed, there's not supposed to be a comma thereafter. They enjoyed picnics. They were skilled embroiders and lace makers, which makes sense because Roland Hassel was coming from, and his wife came from the silk weaving part of Coventry. That was their skill. So it makes sense that it was brought down into the family once they got into Australia. Poor old George and Charles, look at them. Even though they lived to grand ages, they were a constant worry, both of them, to their parents. Neither of them had trades. They tried to go and help out with properties of their brothers and brothers-in-law. George tried his hand at gold digging. They both did droving, and they both had a drink problem. In fact, Charles was banished to Apollo Bay so that he could create a distance between family and drink. Bit of a sad story, but, and you've got the opposite with their younger sister Eliza being a missionary and running a home for missionaries, and she became a life member of the Church Missionary Society. She also looked after her mother for quite a long time, and if you read a little bit on their relationship, Anne Marsden set it up for, she was a difficult customer and she made it quite difficult for Eliza. And she also, just everywhere you turn, you can hear that Anne Marsden is not there because maybe she was a sulker, I don't know, but she would seem to turn her back on a few people. She made things a bit unpleasant, so I believe. Nevertheless, she had her heart in the right place, I'm sure, and had a lot of energy and was involved in a lot of things. Does anybody know about Charlie Dixon? Charles Dixon was saved by Samuel Marsden. He was in a sinking ship. Where the ship was, I'm not quite sure. Tasmania maybe. But if anybody knows, I'd love to know. He was then brought up and worked and stayed with Thomas Hassel and family at Denby for a long time. And he was known as the family butler. But doing some of the transcriptions, we note that Charlie Dixon was out there with his sleeves rolled up, building bridges over creeks and doing everything else as well as being a butler. So that's the children of Thomas and Anne, the third generation. So what about other family members that we've got in the Hassels? And I've just got 2 pages here where we look at people that are well known in society. So I've got little snippets of information about the Hassels, but it's the books that were written, the 8,000 pages in the State Library, that is all set there for us to be able to get together and talk about the Hassels, because we've been left so much information to be able to access, to know them. So we've got Roland and Samuel, father and friend. So the Marsdens embraced the Hassels when they arrived in Sydney with not much at all. After being on a leaky boat for 41 days from Tahiti, the Marsdens took them in, sheltered them and allowed them to get their lives in order and stay in Sydney. Samuel Marsden, he was, not only was he a friend, he turned into being a colleague. Thomas Hassel was assigned to him at St John's, Parramatta, and of course he became Thomas's father-in-law. So Roland and Samuel would have had a lot to do with each other. They were different types of people, so it would have been interesting to watch their interactions. There's a lot written about Samuel Marsden and also the Hassels, so I've just thrown in a few snippets of things. Of course, we could fill all of these bits of information boxes with a lot. So he was senior chaplain. He was looked after orphans. He was very keen in getting education started. He was a magistrate. He was a farmer. He was a wool trader. His wool went to the King of England because it was so fine for the king to have a look at it. And of course, he did those 7 trips to New Zealand. And he constantly wrote to the Sydney Gazette about lots of things over the years. Thomas, of course, we know a lot about Thomas. He was the minister, started Sunday school, kept a diary, there's a lot written about Thomas. And he gave land to a lot of the churches to be built on, and funded a lot of it to actually happen. And there's a few things there. James Hassel, his son, of course, we know he wrote in Old Australia, and he was a minister at Berrima. In fact, he befriended one of the fellows at the Berrima jail and the inmates, and thought he didn't do his deed. So he said to this inmate, when you get out of jail, you can come and work for me. So he went and worked for him. And the fellow then worked for him and was very loyal, until one day when he was working, got mud all over him. He hated it. He said, look at me, I don't get this dirty in jail, did something and went straight back. So that was just a little aside. You've got Mary Cover Hassel. Notice the middle name Cover was Reverend Cover took Anne Marsden to England. So they used the names a lot in naming their children. Even the Eliza is taken on the family name of Marsden there as well. So the missionaries into Tonga with the Lowrys and into the Methodist Church, first church was funded. I think I can't see the word under there. Amy Oxley, of course, was granddaughter of Thomas and Anne and was a missionary into China. I don't know if you've read the book, They Shall See His Face, which is all about, her mission took her into the blind children in China, in Yangchao or some name like that. Don't hold me to that one. Just a few more. We've got Bishop Marsden, all the information there. Father John Hope, Archdeacon George Spencer Oakes. The Oakes married into the Hassels. He was great-grandson. Archdeacon Howell. The Howells came very early into the piece through the Samuel O2 line. Marsden Hassel was the actor in The Moth of Moonby. You've probably read about that in the newsletter. And there's the feature film is going to be rerun, I think, January 2026, perhaps to match up with the 100 years of it. Andrew Hassel in Queensland's had a lot to do with that. Professor Manning Clark through the Hope line. His mother was a Hope, and he was a great-great-grandson of Roland Hassel. Mr. Justice Robert Hope, I hope that's how you write his name, of course, through the Thomas line and the Hope line. Then you've got schools, lots of schools named after the Marsdens and the Hassels. Streets, I've got copious notes, and I've contacted so many people in the local LGAs trying to find out the information they have on the streets, who they're named after. A lot of them love talking to you because I think it's a bit of excitement for them, and a lot of them actually hold wrong information. So if we can do our little bit in trying to correct the wrong information, then we're doing well. And there's a few suburbs, of course, Hasslegrove and Marsden Park in Sydney. Marsden in Queensland is a suburb there. And you probably all know a little bit more than me. So that's just a touch on the generations. And I thought I would hand it over to people now to discuss the Hassel artefacts. Who has things? Who knows things? Where have they come from? Where are they now?
Sorry, Alison, were you going to do that at the end, or
we can do that at the end? And then
did you want to do it now?
No, because it would. If you do your Robert Hope thing now,
yeah,
that would make more sense to follow on from what I've just said, and we can come back to that last page later. So I'm going to hand over to Jenny now. Thanks in advance, Jenny.
Okay, yes. Let's just hope that I can actually get my screen up. How do I do this? Someone's going to have to help me here. Oh, here we go. Ta-da! Look at that. Now, how do I make it big? And how do I do the full screen? Now, so can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So Alison asked me if I do this, and she said, oh, you get 10 minutes. I've run it through myself twice, and I'm already nowhere near 10 minutes. So if you get bored, just keep yourself on mute and whatever. But Alison asked me just to go back a step to give a bit of insight into the Hopes, and specifically the Hopes from Scotland. Yeah. And I apologise for my coughing. I've got a bit of a cold. And I'm just, again, I want to also say what Alison said, which is A, there's a lot of misinformation out there. B, it's I could go on about each one of these things for a very long time. So again, they're snippets, they're just a little overview. Many of you will probably be far more well versed in some of these areas. Anyway, just a flavour is really what we're after. The first thing I just wanted to show you, and I'll just zoom in a bit, is we're looking just at the bit where we've got...
Jenny, sorry, can I interrupt? I can't see anything on my screen. Have other... Oh, is that because I've shared? So do I have to take...
You got to unshare.
Okay, so Graham, how do I unshare?
Just close it. There should be a little button that says stop share, or click it on, click it off, or...
Oh, okay.
I've done it for you.
Oh, you've done it for me? Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So, yes, we're just having a quick overview of this particular line. So James Hope Robert Hope, who's the Robert Culbertson Hope we're interested in, and then who's the father of Robert Culbertson Hope, and just dipping into this line. So pre what Alison was talking about. And like all these things, there's lots and lots of them. So we're just concentrating on the direct line down through Robert Culbertson. As Alison's already alluded to, in case some of you don't know, I'm sure most of you do know, but we have two brothers. So we have Robert and George, who married two sisters, the Hassel sisters. But Robert was actually one of four. So we're just going to have a quick look at some of the background of the time. If you already know this, as I say, I apologise in advance if it's boring. Now, Robert and his siblings came from a place called Morebattle, which is right on very, very close to the border of Scotland and England. And if you look on the left, there's a little pin that shows you roughly where it is. If you look at the top of that column, at the top of that box, you can see Edinburgh and Morebattle right down here. It's about 8 kilometres, 5 miles from the Scottish-English border. You see the little dots there is the border. Lies basically at the foothills of the Cheviot Hills and close to Kelso, lots of names that, of course, we've adopted in this country as well. Morebattle itself actually has nothing to do with wars, comes from a place, from an old English name that meant the lake. So it was a lake between two of those little tiny towns. It's mainly known now because it lies on the ancient pilgrim route, which is now a popular walking trail of St Cuthbert. Some of you may have been to Lindisfarne, which is off the north coast, off the Northumberland, through to Melrose Abbey. And Cuthbert was a saint. He started his religious life in Melrose Abbey and ended it in Lindisfarne, where he was buried initially, although he's no longer there. And so that walk, which is about 100 k's, is a walking path now, and it passes through Morebattle. So you get quite a lot of tourist trade that way. Just to give you a little flavour of the size of the place we're talking about, it's actually much bigger than it is today. So today there's only sort of just under 300 people, but back in the day when we're looking at sort of end of the 1700s, early 1800s, you're tipping around, 800 to 1,000 people. And we're talking about, any of you who've been to that area of the world will know little tiny dots of villages everywhere. We don't really have anything comparable in Australia. We can't imagine never going to the next village, which is only 5 miles away the whole time we're alive. And yet that was very common for those days. People didn't travel. They were very sort of in their little pockets of where they lived. Again, just a little zooming in here, you see lots of these little tiny towns. All of these, would have been around at the time our guys are there. And it's just gorgeous country. This is the Cheviot Hills here. Again, all these little towns still exist, but Morebattle here, little tiny village. We've got an Iron Age relic, a hill from an Iron Age burial here. We've got the Cheviot Hills here. We've got lots of little places which, of course, originally were attached to very large pockets of land owned by landowners, such as Marlfield and Clifton Park and other places like that. Many of which still exist, although, of course, a lot of them have changed into things like hotels and so forth. Sorry? Don't worry about that. We don't have time. You can see Morebattle, little tiny village, lovely maps. I'm an ancestry fiend. I love going online, looking at old maps, all of this gorgeous detail that you can look at if you're interested. But basically, it's unchanged since the 1100s. It really, nothing's much happened. The border's moved a few times with all the skirmishes, and, some of the land parcels have changed as various changes of land owners, but also the agricultural revolution, which we'll come to. But a lot of it just looks exactly like it would have looked 400, 500, 600 years ago. When I mentioned that Morebattle means on a lock, because the lock was drained as part of the agricultural revolution, you've got Morebattle here and a little tiny spot on the map here where we've got relics buried, but in the middle would have been a lake. And that's part of that whole little river. Well, it's not really a river, a little water course that runs through there. That doesn't exist anymore. It's all farming land. But that's where the name came from. Stop me if I'm going too fast. Just to give you a few little pickies, Naomi and I went on a wonderful trip about just a bit under 2 years ago, and we went up to Morebattle from England. You cross the border into Scotland. This is right on the border, actually, and you're looking into the Cheviot Hills and, you know, over into the start of Scotland. Just, you know, gorgeous countryside, of course. That's the Cheviot Hills again, natural border between Scotland and England. Does get snow, sadly. We did not see any, but that's what it would look like in some of those nice photos where it's dusted with snow. And then this is as you get closer to Morebattle. You can see, you know, apart from rolling green hills, we've got sheep, we've got stone walls, we've got old stone buildings, we've got lots of, you know, heath and farmland and heather and so forth. Unchanged since the beginning of time, just about. This is actually taken from Linton Church, which would have been on the other side. You can see this area. This would all originally have been the lake. Again, the Cheviot Hills in the background, but Morebattle, you can see Morebattle, not in this photo, but you can actually see Morebattle from Linton. This is one of the graveyards. You look across to the other graveyard. So it's all really close. And yet people didn't just stayed in their villages, even though they could wave to other people. I find it bonkers. But anyway, the other wonder of the internet, for all its evils, is it does have these wonderful sources that people upload. So there's old postcards of Morebattle. So this is pretty much what it looks like today. But this is back in the early part of the 20th century, just to give you a flavour. Obviously some, you know, decent sort of houses. That church still exists today. This building, which I'll get to in a minute. But the street, good grief, you know, snap, looks exactly the same as it did back 120 years ago. Just focusing on, some of you again will be aware of this, a place called Temple Hall, and Robert Hope, all of the four Hope children are recorded as being born in Morebattle, but also Temple Hall. And this is Temple Hall, it's a building. Although originally the name itself comes from the Knight Templar, nothing to do with religion, except that it was that there are lots of temple halls throughout Scotland. And this building is a low-grade classified building now. And I believe actually that Robert Culbertson Hope's grandfather built it. And I'll get to that in a second as well. But the original building, it looks like this. So this second photo here, this is the original building that would have existed when Robert Culbertson was growing up. He lived in this place. It's now an inn and a hotel, and lots of those people walking that route that I was describing now live there. But that is basically unchanged. Obviously, the innards look completely different, but the outside is pretty much unchanged since the late 1700s. Another little shot. And looking back down what's known as Main Street, very original. This is the back of that building, which again is the back of the house that Robert Culbertson and James and his family lived in. On the left, you would have the church is on the left, and again, the view to the Cheviot Hills. We've got to remember that in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we've got that mini ice age happening, and we're talking serious levels of snow, bitingly cold winds, you know, getting cut off, very harsh climate, which we don't really resonate with, of course. But it made travel would have been difficult and, you know, just hard yakka, basically. So the background to just pre when Robert is born, we've got, again, many of you will know more than I do about Scottish history in terms of landowners and holders, but typically they had a lot of very large landowners who had a system where people worked the land and they rented. Scots law is very complicated and nothing like we recognise now, old Scotch law in particular, and it was very complicated with the way they had the ownership of land and passing things on and so forth, lots of weird words. But basically, the lairds owned the land and then they had tenant farmers who worked it for them and paid rent in either kind or labour. General sort of agriculture, although there wasn't a wide variety of crops. Sheep, of course, became very big in that area. And all these weird terms which come up in their wills and in various language, which look like spelling mistakes to us, but actually are real words. The one I've highlighted is significant because they had a distinction between what is called heritable or immovable property, and that was lands and building and structures, and movable property, which could be moved, like goods and chattels, livestock, farm equipment, and so forth. And if you had the laird or the landowner, he might grant you a rental right with various terms on it, but he always owns the property. But you can still pass that property on when you die. So it's kind of weird because even though the laird owns it, it is actually able to be given to your children and passed on. I'm actually getting the original copy of the document, but that's another story. So we've got James Hope. Now, James is Robert Culbertson's grandfather. In 1769, and he's just, Bobby Basic farmer like all of the rest of them, William Durton, who's a significant landholder in the lowlands, we're talking about the lowlands of Scotland, granted a rental right to James. Now, I don't know why they chose certain people. Maybe there were people who worked extra hard or for whatever reason, but it was a big deal because he then gets the opportunity to have heritable and movable property. And he's a tiny player in the area, but it means he could build Temple Hall, he could build buildings. He kind of had an opportunity to improve himself in a way that tenant farmers couldn't. He had an extraordinarily detailed will, which I have a copy of if anyone's interested. It's 15 pages and it's written in all this dense text, but it refers to that rental right granted in 1769, and it refers to the buildings around Temple Hall and within Morebattle. So it's likely that, he was a big cheese at the time within the town. So he dies in 1806 and he's buried in Linton Kirk, the other side of the lake, and his son, Robert, inherits. So he inherits Temple Hall, that building, and the land and everything else. But the interesting thing about the will, and if you remember, women couldn't own property in their own right, James makes significant and quite detailed provisions, not only for financial support, but also for housing for his wife, his remaining 3 living daughters, and his 2 grandchildren who are the offshoots of his deceased daughter. Very detailed, very specific, and generous provisions that were in the will. And at the time, Robert wasn't married and didn't have children. So if he continued not to marry or have children, Temple Hall and everything would eventually pass to the grandson, because at the time he was the only direct male heir. As we know, that doesn't happen, but that was the original part of the will. This is also in the will, which I find absolutely fascinating. So in 1806, this is what he has when he dies. So he's now gone. He now owns cows, horses, pigs. He's got things that he works the land with. He's got crops of wheat and barley and oats and rye. He has a threshing floor. He has corn. He's got lint. He's got tables and chairs and clocks and kitchen furniture and various other things. He's got beehives and butter, all of which is valued as part of his estate. Table linen, metal watch. And that came to 414 Scotch pounds, which is quite a significant amount of money, actually, at the time. The other interesting thing, again, the marvellous records that you can get off various sources, is we get a little window when you look into things like the tax rolls. So, of course, glass was enormously expensive. So you had to pay a tax on your windows. That's one reason why the windows are so small, because the size of the window dictated how much tax you paid as well. So in 1797, James, so this is the grandfather, has to pay 4 shillings in tax for the 8 windows that he's got in his house. He's got a dog, he's got to pay tax on that. He's got 2 horses, he's got to pay tax on that. Then when you get to the land tax rolls 3 years before he dies, his Temple Hall and the lands around it are valued at £69. So even though the Lord remains as the eventual owner, James has a value to what he owns and his property. And again, that would have been quite significant, even though it's only, less than 2% of the total parish, which was valued at £16,000 at the time. So if we then move to Robert Hope, so this is Robert Culbertson's father. he takes over. When James dies, he becomes the proprietor, which is not to do with running an alcoholic institution like we would know, but he becomes the owner and the holder of all of that property. And we know that it remained a house during Robert and Joan's lifetime, because Marianne Hope and George go back into 1876. They go back to England and Scotland. They go back to Morebattle and traipse around and look at all the old sites. And there's a reference in there to the old house being turned by then into an inn. And George shows Marianne the rooms and talks about, it doesn't look anything like it used to look, but it is still there, obviously. So Robert marries Joan. They have 4 children. This is where our players enter. We've got James and Robert, George and Isabella. And I'm sure again, many of you know this, but forgive me if you don't. I mean, forgive me if you do. But we are talking about a time when we've got no sort of official records apart from what the church held. As you know, church was in all countries was a very significant player in recording births, deaths and marriages and what else might be going on. We don't even have the first census in Scotland until 1841, by which time we've already left. The official births, deaths and marriages records don't happen until 1855. So again, we haven't got anything. So we can only get parish registers and the local court session books, calling of the banns, payments for death cloths, mort cloths that go over coffins or people are wrapped in as shrouds, parish registers, tax rolls, to give us a window into what's going on. The other complication, as you would all know, is we have got multiple generations of cousins marrying each other. We've got the same names that are used over and over. We've got multiple names within the families. The son called Robert dies, so the next son is called Robert. So you can have, multiple Roberts with the same name. Nobody has a middle name. Very, very difficult to actually track and make sure that you've got the right person. Multiple spellings, names used interchangeably. So we've got Culbertson and Cuthbertson. They're all the same. We've got Jeanette, we've got Jane, we've got Jean, we've got Joan, we've got Janet. The same Joan might be called Janet somewhere else. The same Janet might be called Jeanette somewhere, So it becomes very difficult to disentangle it. Spelling, of course, was a bit laissez-faire. We don't have a lot of people who can read and write. All of which is just to say that I think, firstly, we still have quite a lot of records, but when you compare it with what we have in Australia, with the depth and the detail, quite amazing that we have those records, and we shouldn't dismiss that. But it also makes piecing together much beyond these generations really quite difficult because of some of these constraints on what's recorded. Anyway, moving along. Sorry, I'm taking too much time here. Robert and Joan both die in 1826. Now, what they die of, we don't know. There's no death certificates. There's no records. We know that poverty and disease and illness are a big deal. You didn't take much to sweep through a town with whatever was going around. There were 2 significant cholera epidemics that swept the world. Even in little Scotland, eventually that gets to Scotland and wipes out an enormous numbers of people across the world. What they die of, we don't know. But the children, the significant thing is the children are all in their minority. So we've got James, who's only 16, Robert's only 14, George is only 12, and Isabella's only 9. They're orphans. There is an ancestry contact I have who actually happens to be a Culbertson, who says that the family story is that Joan's unmarried sister Mary actually looked after the children. Again, we have no way of knowing that. We don't know where that was, but certainly somebody has taken them in and looked after them until at least James reaches an age where he can go out and work. Robert and Joan are buried in Morebattle churchyard, Temple Hall, and this beautiful, I mean, wouldn't you want to be buried there? Look at that. Views of the Cheviot Hills, gorgeous. So we've got our orphans. We've also got change happening in Scotland. We've got the agricultural revolution has taken hold, and that happens in both the lowlands and the highlands, although we tend to only think of the clearances in the highlands. It did also happen in the lowlands. So we've got agricultural revolution, we've got crop rotation, bigger changes in the numbers of crops that are grown. There's a desire to have more efficient farms, and mechanisation is increasing and so forth. So you've got all these people where the landowners are consolidating, reducing the number of workers, changing their practices, and lots and lots and lots of displaced people. That is giving and so they're either going into the cities or they're emigrating. Now, we actually we know that Robert Hope graduated in 1834 in Edinburgh. He wrote a gripping document on the excision of the joints, and he then becomes an assistant in Howick, which is again not far from Morebattle, for several years. And it's likely that James and George both worked in agriculture because, again, Marianne's diary references when they go back to Morebattle, George trots off and visits all the relatives, the farms he worked on, the people who taught him all his skills and so forth. So we then have all 4 children emigrating to Australia, all within a few months of each other. Robert and Isabella, go on the Bounty ship, the late Lady Kennaway. Robert goes as the assistant ship surgeon, and the surgeon on board is Robert Waugh, who brother David Lindsay Waugh is who Isabella later marries. And as you can see, we're starting to get this huge wave of immigration. So when you look into Trove, you see that when the Lady Kennaway arrives at the end of 1838, you've got these guys on board. This is where they went, blah, blah, blah. We've got Dr. Waugh. He was the surgeon superintendent. We've got his sisters. We've got Dr. Hope. We've got Miss Hope, that's Isabella. And we've got 276 Scotch immigrants. So the whole ship is full of people coming to Australia under the Bounty scheme. And James and George also both emigrate the same year, arriving separately, but within sort of 1838, early 39. And then just to finish, just a little tiny snippet of what that emigration, those waves of emigration meant. Of course, we've got the Irish famines happening. We've got the clearances in Scotland. We've got issues in Britain, of course, same sort of things happening. We've got all these people with nowhere to go. So there's masses who go to Canada and the US. Then there's a shift. And between about the end of the 1830s to sort of the early 1840s, Australia becomes the flavour of the month. And that is, and again, these numbers and the references, you know, because the records are a bit hard to decipher, we know there are about 20-something bounty ships that came out from Scotland alone, because there were various schemes where either the government or the company paid for workers to come out under a bounty system. Our guys didn't come out as under bounty. Well, actually, I don't know about James and George, but certainly Robert wouldn't have. They came out as unassisted. But even so, we've got massive numbers of people leaving. We've got around 10,500 people who came who didn't pay for their passage, who did pay for their passage, who arrive in Sydney from overseas and other ports just in that 1837, 1842 timeframe alone. Australia-wide, we've got about 60,000 immigrants. And we've got lots of people coming from Scotland, but the Irish are still the vast majority of the number of people who come out, the percentage of people who come out, somewhere around 60, 65%. Once we get to the unassisted people passage, a lot of those are more middle class, craftsmen, professionals. And again, the lowlands tended to have a greater proportion of those than the highlands. And there's a great document that talks about all of that, which I won't bore you with, but it does actually reference David Waugh as a young lawyer from Edinburgh. So he's the one who comes out and eventually marries Isabella. Again, this document talks about 1839 being significant for the number of settlers who come out, huge influx of Scots into the Port Phillip district, which of course is where Robert and George eventually end up, and James. And some of these large companies getting significant levels of capital to invest in, the development of the colony and the different states and the various industries that are being undertaken. It's described as a Scotch colony with 2/3 of the inhabitants being Scotch when this guy first comes to the Western District. And then that kind of morphs into, the Hopes and what we know they went on to become significant players in many aspects of all parts of what was going on in Australia. And just as a little snippet, we've got Robert Hope in 1879. His estate was valued at what would have been in 2020 around about 4.5 million Australian dollars. So, significant increase just in one of those children. And of course, we know George and Robert and James between them had an enormous body of wealth, which of course, when the 1890 crash happens, you know, all those, it all gets whittled away through bad management and crashes and liabilities and so forth. So there we go. That's a little flavour, a very long snippet. I'm sorry, I ended up being too long, but lots of interesting stuff that we could go on and on about.
Well, Jenny, I can't thank you enough. What a riveting session that you've just given us. And the whole idea was, when Jenny and I were talking, was to show what is the background of these people that come out to Australia, and we know them from Australia onwards, but we don't know what they've come from. So I thought it would just be exciting to get a look back further into one of them. So thank you very much. It brings us up to a time where we can have a bit of a look at artifacts, and then turn off the computers and have a sip of wine or something. Would anybody like to say anything to Jenny or ask her a question or anything? I just, it's very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. There's a lot of concise information in there. So something I've learnt tonight. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Jenny, I want to say it's just fantastic.
Very interesting.
And we just want to keep on with the story of the Hopes in Australia, and how they marry the two sisters, and the story of their lives. So I hope that you can keep that going, and that we can have more sessions from you. And I also want to thank Alison for the wonderful introduction. I learned things in the introduction. So this is a splendid evening. Just want to thank you. And I'm sure there are other questions. I do have one question, Jenny, about the religious profession of the Hopes, because I understand that it was a slightly different to the Hassel confession. And do you have anything to say about that? Because I have a letter in which Catherine was talking about the delicate matter of difference of faith.
Yeah, well, I thought about going into that, and I thought that just takes you into a whole different tangent. But the other background to Scotland, of course, is we do have a lot of, there's quite a significant tussle in the 1700s between various arms of what would have been known as the Scotch Church. And in fact, one branch of the Culbertsons, so that's Robert, up his maternal line, they kind of break away, and there's what's it called, the Succession Church. But even in Morebattle, there's about 6 different churches in a town of 1,000. You know, I would call them Scots Presbyterians. That's what I would have said was their flavour. The church had a bit of a schism in Morebattle alone about who would be the leaders, and people had to choose. And in fact, in that letter, in that diary in 1876, there is made reference to some of the fallout of that in terms of going to hear different preachers, and you know, this one was better than that one, or more closely aligned to the gospel, or whatever it might have been. So there is a lot of that, but I don't know a lot of the detail. But certainly I could imagine coming out, as we had in our time, there would have been a bit of butting of heads. And of course, you know, typical Scots, I mean, the Hopes just completely fill that stereotype of Scotsmen who, you know, very hard line about their morals and how they conduct themselves, and the way church is hugely significant in their framework. And whether as individuals they upheld that, I don't know, but certainly there might well have been tensions when they came out in, you know, with Catherine and what she would have believed. I can't really answer that, but
Yeah, no, it wasn't a worry to Catherine, but it was to Anne Hassel. But look, I'll hand over to others. Richard, I was thinking, because your microphone doesn't sound good at all, but you could type any comment or query, and we will see it in the comment section. So that's just a tip to you. But then I hand back to Alison I'm sure there are other questions either for Alison or for Jenny.
Well, I think if there are no questions, does anybody want to bring anything up about the artifacts from those 3 generations, or or just to start, throw an idea out there that we can think about and we can pick up on next time, because I know we're coming to a closing time, but is there anything that somebody wants to just throw out there?
I just wanted to dip in. Sorry, I don't want to dominate, but I do know that when we went to the Hassel reunion, that subject came up, and there were quite a lot of things thrown around about things that people had or things that are held, for example, in the Powerhouse Museum and so forth. But I thought we had a record of some of those that we did at that reunion, and I can't remember where that all got to, but, you know, talking about what happens to them, and I don't know, it could be wrong, but yeah.
Well, it's the age-old question. I think that we really don't. We all have lots of ideas, but I don't think there's anything concrete. And of course, as years go by, everywhere just gets filled up that much more. So it's an issue that should be aired, kept on the table the whole time. But I don't know a lot about it. And I don't own any tangible items really either. So some people do and some people don't. So it's just an idea that, you know, where do things go when you've got somebody in the family and they've got something? Where do they go? Who do they go with? How long do they stay in a family? When do they become part of what is significant for us, all Australians to see? You know, I don't know. Don't have any answers, but something that needs to be thrown out there.
Yeah, I wonder, even something like in old Australia where there's multiple copies, but it wouldn't take more than a few generations more to that sort of kind of key document to be lost to sight, I suppose, or just as the generations expand. I'm quite happy to, you know, I've got a copy. I know various family members who have a copy. I don't even know if it's worth keeping a record of that.
Well, hopefully there's a copy. Where do all the copies go to?
Oh.
Digital library has a copy of everything.
Yeah, that's true.
Something, but
Public
yeah,
record.
I've got a copy of that, and I misplaced it for a while, and I tell you what, it didn't leave my mind until I found it again. So, but I've got it now.
I've got one of the first editions. I think you and Naomi and Marg have copies of the
reprint.
The reprint that was there were 1,000
Yeah.
copies.
Yeah.
So, you know, the publishing house, of course, that originally produced it, I don't think exists anymore. I don't know. But in the back of Old Australia, there's a list of the contributors who presumably would all have got a copy. And so they would have, you know, but how you track them all, I wouldn't have a clue. Probably some of them have done what they do in Antiques Roadshow and they've got tossed in a skip and wouldn't know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and even if we don't say too much about it, even if we all think about it and wonder, and might open up conversations between other people, you know, what do you do?
Would it be better to have a digitalised copy?
It got Margaret's attention.
So
I think we already.
you mean in old Australia, or you mean just generally?
Yeah, the book. The book
is
because-
available online, actually.
Okay.
Pretty
Yeah,
sure.
On Project Gutenberg.
Yeah, I think
You can-
you can
You
access
can get it from Amazon.
Okay. No, we've got a
Yeah.
copy of it.
Hmm.
But I was just thinking, you know, the generations moving forward are always on their iPads or technology, you know, doing everything by that sort of thing. And would it be easier for them to read and have a copy of if it was in a Hassel booklet or something, you know, the history of the Hassels, that sort of setup?
Probably run into copyright issues, I would think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's an excellent point, that we are very much about what we can touch and put on a shelf and be aware of. But that should, yeah, absolutely, consideration should be given to that. What can be made available easily online.
I might stop the recording now, and then we can just chat on till the end. So recording will stop now.